To our democracy. Okay. Welcome to Our Democracy Under Siege, how to rebuild a better and more just democracy. Thank you all for joining us today. We had some wonderful election results in Watertown this week and in Boston, but there is much work to be done around the country. This forum is sponsored by Progressive Watertown. Progressive Watertown is a chapter of Progressive Massachusetts, which works to pass legislation focusing on shared prosperity, racial and social justice, good government, and environmental sustainability in Massachusetts. If you'd like more information, please visit progressivemassachusetts.org. My name is Eileen Ryan. I am a member of Progressive Watertown and one of the organizers of this forum, along with Caroline Bays, Rita Colafella, and Diane Tiernan. Before we begin, let us acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts tribe. The original peoples who lived here stewarded the land and fished in the river, which they called Quinobaquin. We acknowledge that this land is unceded and remains sacred to the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. We recognize the violence perpetrated upon Indigenous people by the colonial settlers who occupied what is now Watertown, and we stand in solidarity with Indigenous people who today resist erasure and struggle to regain their sovereignty. I now welcome our panelists and moderator and thank them for their time. After our panelists speak, there will be time for questions and answers. We will address as many questions as possible that are posed using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We ask that questions be respectful and that you remember a question is a sentence that ends in a question mark. All attendees will be muted throughout the forum. Our first panelist is Professor Danielle Allen. Danielle is a classicist and political scientist. She is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University, Harvard's highest faculty honor. She is the director of the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. Danielle is a political theorist who is known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. Danielle Allen is a 2022 candidate for governor of Massachusetts. Welcome, Danielle. I know you're on a tight schedule and need to leave early. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Our second panelist is Quentin Paulfrey. Quentin is a lawyer and public policy professional with extensive experience in state and federal government. Quentin was a political appointee in the Obama administration and briefly in the Biden administration. He was the Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts in 2018 and ran on the ticket with Jay Gonzalez. Welcome, Quentin. Our third panelist is Jay Kaufman. Jay Kaufman is the founding president of Beacon Leadership Collaborative in Lexington. He served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from the 15th Middlesex District, representing Lexington, Woburn, and Arlington from 1995 to 2019. Welcome, Jay. I did have you on a tight schedule. It might be late, but you're here ahead of time, so thank you. Our moderator today is Michael Ansara. Michael is a longtime activist and organizer. Most recently, he helped to establish Together for 2020, a clearinghouse for volunteers who worked on elections in swing states in the 2020 election cycle. Together for 2020 is now Together We Elect and is gearing up for the 2022 midterm elections. Michael is also a poet and writer. Welcome, Michael. And now Michael will officially begin the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you all for being here. I don't think it is hyperbole to say that we meet at a time when American democracy is threatened more profoundly than at any time since the years leading up to the Civil War. So we have a panel to dig into why this is happening, and most importantly, their thoughts about what we can do to correct it. So let's jump right in. Danielle Allen.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Progressive Watertown and Progressive Mass, for organizing this important conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here with Quentin and Jay as well, who have been leaders in this space. It's great to see you all. So there is no question but that we face a moment where our constitutional democracy is broken. We're not the first cohort of Americans to face such a moment by any stretch of the imagination. Michael alluded to the period before the Civil War. There's also the period between 1776 and 1787 when nothing worked. They couldn't achieve a budget in Congress. They couldn't achieve a quorum in Congress. Nobody was showing up. And so a group of people from Congress, actually across parties, just on their own accord, nobody asked them to, decided to have a meeting. They met in a pub in Annapolis. And we now know this meeting as the Annapolis Convention, but it was just an occasion for a bunch of people to say out loud together, it's broken, what are we going to do? The result of their saying that out loud together was the Constitutional Convention. And of course, the effort to achieve a real transformation for the early republic. They failed in so many deep and profound ways that are with us still with regard to the compromises around enslavement and the like. But the important point of the story is just that change, transformation starts from a group of people taking the time to step aside and say, it's broken. So I'm grateful for this space and for the leadership that all of you are showing in lifting up that conversation. So we each have had our own red alert moments, I think, for knowing that things are broken. For me, there are a couple. There was the moment in 2013 when Congress had an approval rating of 9%. I saw that and I thought, oh my gosh, but Congress is supposed to be the voice of the people. If the people approves of itself at a rate of 9%, then it's broken. That feeling was then powerfully reinforced for me the morning after the Trump election in 2016. I was teaching that fall. I had a 9 a.m. Wednesday morning class. And so I was the first older person that my kids were seeing that morning after the surprising result. I chucked my usual lecture. I just wanted to give them space to share their thoughts and feelings and reflections and questions. And it was one of those old-fashioned ancient classrooms with fixed seating, so I didn't ask anybody to stand up, but the first young man I called on did stand up, and he looked at me and he said, you have all just abandoned us. And I was sort of taken aback, thinking, what? I didn't vote for Donald Trump. What is he talking about? And I wrote my heart out for a year in the Washington Post against the election of Donald Trump. And he continued and he said, we have just lost the critical years we need to change the direction of the existential threat of climate change. And I'm still processing, trying to understand how he meant that was my responsibility. Then he concluded, your generation has just abandoned our generation by letting the politics of this country get to such a point that the election of Donald Trump was the result. And I tell that story, we have to hear that story in relationship to another alarm bell, another data point, the fact that for generational cohorts born before World War II, 70% of that cohort think it's essential to live in a democracy. For people 40 and under, millennials, not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. Now, my student was saying why. My student was saying, why should I care about this democracy? Why should I have a sense of connection to it when it can't deliver for what I see as the most pressing challenge of our generation, the challenge of climate change? And I think if we listen to the voices of young people, we can hear over and over again how two themes come together. Our broken politics has left us unable to deliver on the hardest, most pressing problems of our time. So that's the job that I see we have ahead of us, is to ensure that our democratic institutions can deliver in relationship to those most pressing challenges. So the question then, of course, is what's to be done? Where do we go from here, given the division, given the polarization, given the fact that even our school committees are being riven by the bullying and intimidating behavior of adults who no longer have a respect for the boundaries of the rule of law and constitutionalism and shared decision-making. I think that there are a lot of really basic fundamental things that are necessary. We do need to protect the right to vote, and we're doing that here in Massachusetts. That's job number one. But it's not enough to protect the right to vote. We have to re-engage people. And here I'm thinking of a gentleman I visited with in Springfield, Mass. A couple of weeks ago. I visited a church, and after church, we had a conversation about the work we need to do on housing, on climate, on transportation. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about the work we could do together. But then an older man stood up and he said, well, but we've hoped before. We've tried before and we were disappointed. Why should we try again? The thing that's missing over and over again when people don't engage is an experience of efficacy, of being able to get something done, of being able to name a problem and get it done together. So as we think about the work of saving our democracy, or achieving it, I think of more so than saving it, because it's been broken for the whole of our history. We need to achieve our democracy for the first time. As we think about that work, we have to ensure that what we can actually do is give people an experience of getting things done together, getting positive things done together. So we protect the vote, but then we actually have to put tools in people's hands to achieve that. One of those tools, I think, is real work on the health of our media ecosystem. We need to really rebuild the ecosystem of local journalism. And I think there are a lot of ways that we can do that, with tax credits for philanthropic support of local journalism, with collaborations for local media outlets across the Commonwealth. But we need to get back to a place where people can anchor their engagement in our political life with a healthy system and ecosystem of local journalism. We also need transparency and accountability in the executive branch. I think it's really important that our executive branch adhere to the same public records requests and standards as we require of our local municipalities. The executive branch can set a standard for transparency and accountability. We need campaign finance reform. Massachusetts needs to move forward on the 28th Amendment so that we can put an end to Citizens United. Both sides need to de-escalate on the massive spending in elections, and that de-escalation has to happen at the same time, sort of like nuclear disarmament. That takes a constitutional amendment. And here's one other thing I will throw out as a solution, something that we can draw on and use. There's terrific work, new tools called deliberative polling that somebody at Stanford, James Fishkin, has been developing over the last 20 years. This is a set of tools that can be put in the hands of anybody, local communities, state governments, to bring communities together across divides for shared decision-making on hard problems. And this work has been done, he's done all over the world at this point. He's done deliberative polls from Texas to Mongolia to Ireland, California. And when this work is undertaken, what he finds is what happens is people come together, you get a representative sample of people, so as if you're doing a public opinion poll, a big spread of people, but demographically representative. You don't just poll their opinion, you don't just start by asking what they think. You do that first, but then you engage people in a structured, moderated conversation, and then look at the end of the conversation to where their opinions are. You re-poll. And when they do this with a structured conversation between the two polling moments, they find that people move, they change their opinion, polarization comes out of the conversation, and you can get productive solutions. They've recently just done a major deliberative poll on climate change and found Republicans moving 20 percentage points in the directions of support for ambitious action on climate change, and finding people on both sides of the spectrum moving in similar directions, finding ways to come to shared purpose. I could give many more examples of the success of this method, but I think it's a set of tools we need to put in the hands of local school committees, city councils, and our state government to give us a chance to rebuild productive decision-making together. The reason for that, again, is to come back to this basic point. In order for us to secure confidence in our democracy, we have to prove it can deliver for all of us and for our most pressing needs. So we need all those institutional reforms, but at the same time, each and every one of us needs the experience of being effective, getting to solutions while working with others. We have to have that lived, felt experience in order to rebuild our confidence in democracy. If we can give people that experience, then that gives us fuel to continue reforming and achieving the health of a multicultural, inclusive democracy for the 21st century. There's so much more to say, but I'll leave it there for the moment and just thank you all for pulling this important conversation together. Oh, I think once somebody's muted, exactly that's right. I can't unmute. So there you go, Michael.
Sorry about that, folks. I muted myself. Thank you, Danielle. Our next speaker is Quentin. Quentin, over to you if Jonathan will unmute you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to Progressive Watertown. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Danielle, for your wonderful remarks. I look around on the chat and see so many friendly faces who are so supportive of me when I ran for Lieutenant Governor in 2018. So thank you very much. I'm Quentin Paulfrey. I recently founded an organization called the Voter Protection Corps that I'll talk about a little bit. And I'm exploring a campaign for Attorney General that I would only run if our terrific Attorney General decides not to run for re-election. But I wanted to start someplace that Danielle took us, which is how the reforms to our democracy and the attacks on our democracy relate to all of the other priorities that we have. So I first got interested in voting rights as an area of focus as a lawyer in the wake of the 2000 election, when poor ballot design and really bad judicial decision-making changed the course of history. So if you think about the existential crisis of climate change and think about how different the way that we experience that would be if Al Gore had become president rather than George W. Bush, you can see the sort of the history-making consequences of some of these voter protection issues. And in the 2004 election, I had the opportunity to go work as the voter protection director for the Kerry Edwards campaign in New Hampshire. And we were coming off of a cycle in which there was a criminal conspiracy to jam the phone lines of the Get Out the Vote operation at some unions and Democratic Party headquarters. And so we saw some of the sort of direct dirty tricks that a lot of people associate with this space. And in that cycle, we were combating overt voter suppression targeting students. So they were sliding flyers under the doors of the dorm rooms of the college students the night before the election, telling them that they would go to jail if they voted in New Hampshire during that election. And we ran a massive voter protection effort, and we were thrilled to turn New Hampshire from red to blue. It turned out that that was the only state that turned from red to blue that night. And as we were starting to celebrate in our headquarters in Manchester, we had the TV screens on in the headquarters, and our hearts began to sink because we saw these massive lines in the African-American communities in Cleveland and Columbus, where voters of color were waiting hours and hours to vote. Many of them didn't have an opportunity to vote at all. Those delays in those communities may have caused Kerry to lose that election. And in the next cycle, I continued to work on these voter protection issues, and that was how I met Barack Obama. And I saw him in New Hampshire, saw in him a lot of the same kinds of dynamism that many of us came to see. And I started to follow him around from state to state to state, working on these voter protection issues. And I had the opportunity in the general election to take on that challenge of Ohio, which was at the time one of these sort of key battleground states. And we swore that we were not going to let those challenges that had faced that set of voters in 2004 to happen on our watch. So we put 4,000 lawyers into the field that year. It was the largest voter protection effort that we had ever run. We went to the Ohio Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court, and I was proud to be part of the team that helped elect President Obama, and proud of the opportunity to go into his administration and work on trying to deal with some of the challenges of economic inequality and racial inequality and the climate crisis. And in the 2016 election, alongside a lot of you, I worked really hard to try to elect a president that would carry on those values. And what we've seen since then has just been devastating. So the Trump administration had a cruelty to it. But there also was this attack, this overt attack on the fundamental underpinnings of our democracy. They didn't believe in truth. They didn't believe in science. They attacked the Constitution. There was a deep-seated racism to the way in which they tried to weaponize obstacles to registering, voting, and having votes count that characterized both that administration and the re-election effort. And so a number of us who had worked on voter protection efforts for a number of years got together and pulled together a group along with some data scientists to try to anticipate the sets of places where voters were most likely to run into voter protection challenges and put in place a series of solutions well in advance of the 2020 election to try to deal with some of those challenges. But we couldn't have anticipated what came up next, which was not only did we have an unhinged re-election effort of President Trump, but we also faced a pandemic that transformed the way that voters were voting. And all in all, I think collectively, we faced those twin challenges with remarkable success last year. Through a series of strategies. Some of them were increasing vote by mail, which is a tool that we've seen works extremely well, and with some very serious implementation challenges in a couple of states as an exception, has really dramatically improved the voting environment for a lot of voters. Expansions of early voting, which I think is an incredibly important tool. And also a series of strategies aimed at increasing in-person voting. And here I just want to highlight one of the most important issues, which is there are really very significant differences in terms of how people experience voting, depending on where they live and the color of their skin and their age. In-person voting is disproportionately used by communities of color. And so as you're developing strategies for increasing access to the polls, we absolutely need to push on vote by mail, but we cannot ignore the important efforts to make sure that people can vote in person, vote early in person, and vote on election day in person for some of these racial justice reasons. So now we've seen, I mean, we all watched in horror as a set of, in many cases, white supremacists and folks who are intent on undermining our democracy, laid siege to our Capitol as members of Congress were in the process of performing one of their most sacred duties. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do in this moment to take back our democracy? And I would suggest three things and really look forward to having a broader conversation. But the first thing I would say is that while I have some confidence, I had the opportunity and the honor to serve in the Biden administration as the acting general counsel of commerce. I have some confidence that we're going to make some progress on the national level, but I think we would be foolish to put all of our energy there. So I think we're going to have to look to state reforms. There is a very important conversation going on in Bacon Hill around the Votes Act, and I think that we do need to fight this out state by state. The second thing I would say is that local democracy is one of the places that we can have the most impact. If I think sort of long-term in terms of the challenges to our democracy, the trend that excites me the most is the energy that I see at the grassroots level: more diverse candidates, more women running for office, more first-time candidates, people, young people getting engaged in their democracy. And I think as we think about how we are going to solve these problems, how we're going to claw our way out of these attacks on our democracy, one of the most promising places is to invest in local races, invest in that candidate who's running for the first time for school committee, for city council, invest in trying to help mentor first-time candidates and get people out to your local elections. And then the third thing I would say is that there is a mismatch between when we tend to focus on the challenges to our democracy, which is right before an election, as part of GOTV, as part of election day operations, when people are excited about the election a few weeks before, and when the problems that actually face voters are most solvable, which is often now for 2022. Right. And we need to invest in solving the problems before they happen, taking voter protection and voting rights as a long-term, year-round, year in and year out kind of a thing, as opposed to maybe I'll take off election day, maybe I'll spend a couple of days canvassing at the end of GOTV weekend. Most of those problems are solvable much farther upstream if we're smart about targeting our resources to them. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Thank you for including me, and look forward to talking about some of the details as we go forward.
Thank you, Quentin. Our next speaker is Jay Kaufman. Jonathan, if you'd unmute Jay.
Well, let me first thank you for having me as part of this conversation. It's great to be in such good company. The advantage of going last is much of what I would have said, what I had planned to say has already been said. So let me try to move into some new territory, different territory at least. First of all, I stumbled on the subtext or subtitle for this afternoon's discussion, how to rebuild a better and more just democracy. Rebuild, maybe build. To Danielle's point at the beginning about achieving a democracy, and before that, Eileen's point about the indigenous people from whom we stole the land. So our very flawed constitution is built on a very shaky foundation of racism, a disempowerment of large sectors of our population, including women. I think where we begin, if we're wanting to build a democracy, is a little bit of truth and reconciliation, a little truth telling about who we are and who we aren't, and where we have missed the mark. And that's not part of the American mythology, but I think it's a really important element of any movement forward if we're going to have anything come out of this that's different than more of the same. I want to focus a couple of remarks on things really close to home. I served in the legislature for 24 years. And to Quentin's point about starting local, our state legislature, at least the House, is fundamentally broken. It is anything but democratic. And what has happened over time is increasing concentration of power in the office of the speaker. And this is not a criticism of the speaker or any of his predecessors. It's a criticism of the system that has had members of the institution ceding their power to the speaker. And it's inevitable that if you find a system in which there is somebody who is super empowered, in a democracy, that's because the people who have the power have ceded it to somebody else, and they've given it up. So the members of the House need to reclaim their power. And unfortunately, the culture there is such that that's going to take a lot of work, because the going along to get along is about deference to the point of complicity with a system that is fundamentally broken. So we, the voters, need to start making demands on our state representatives and state senators to pay more attention to us and less to the Speaker of the House. That's what democracy is all about. So we don't want to be naive about that, because in an institution of 160 members, you can't simply have a gaggle. You can't just simply have no structure whatsoever. And there's a role for an enlightened head of the institution and somebody who understands how to preside as the first among equal. That's not what we have now. That is not what we've had for a long time. And changing that culture is going to be really important. So in addition to the voting reforms that have been mentioned already, some of the national issues, we've got to start paying attention to these local races and critically get some new candidates to run. candidates with a vision for a participatory democracy that doesn't include surrendering their voice and their vote in the name of a trade-off. Let me be clear about this, though. The trade-offs are very tempting. I had as my top priority for the last 10 years in the legislature what became the Fair Share Amendment to the Constitution that will be on the ballot next year. It felt to me to be really important to get our tax system right so that the poor were paying their fair share, but the wealthy were paying their fair share. And right now the poor are paying a disproportionate amount and the wealthy not nearly enough. That felt like a fundamental reform. In order to be in a position to advance that, I needed to make a lot of compromises in order to stay in the good graces of the speaker and a succession of speakers. So in the name of some larger purpose that I thought was really important, I did some things that are very disquieting and were uncomfortable for me. And I wasn't called on that by my constituents. That's the piece that's missing. I should have been called on that by my constituents so that I could have gone into the speaker and say, yeah, I'd love to be with you, Mr. Speaker. It's not out of disrespect, but my constituents to whom I owe my office are demanding something different of me. The voice right now of the people is too weak. So part of enhancing democracy is we, the citizens, doing our part. A couple of last quick points, maybe not so quick. One of the major ingredients in anything that we might consider a democracy is civics education. And we have been woefully inadequate in that regard. And a vibrant democracy demands an informed and engaged citizenry. And we can't really expect good leaders if we collectively aren't taking responsibility for making sure the next generation, the generation of voters and leaders to come, has a clear understanding of their rights and their responsibilities as citizens. We've ignored civics education for 2 generations now, at least. And I think we're seeing the price for that. So any effort to rebuild or build democracy has to include going back to what Horace Mann first invented in the early part of the 19th century, a public education system whose primary responsibility, but 2 primary responsibilities. One was to, as a social balance wheel, to deal with the inequities within society. It's really important to remember that was important to him in launching public education. But the other one was that he understood, as we all should, that you cannot have a democracy absent as an informed and engaged citizenry. That is the purpose of public education. And we have somehow or other missed the mark on that. The last thing I'll say, in the way of being provocative here, I think we, the progressive community, need some serious family therapy. We have been, the shorthand I use for this is that we are so enamored of the power of our values that we forget about the value of power. We need to understand that somehow or other our differences need to be reconciled enough so that our values are advanced in a way that is meaningful. We've gotten, and I saw this in my years in the House, and I've seen it in the electorate in general, we've gotten so good at righteous indignation when we lose that we're not doing the hard work of winning in a major kind of way, in a systemic kind of way, in a sustainable kind of way. And I think that is a fundamental piece of work that we, those of us in this conversation, need to acknowledge that we need to do. I'd love to talk more about sort of what leadership looks like under these circumstances, and maybe that'll come up in the Q&A, but that's where I'm spending my time now. So with that, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Jay. So I'm encouraging people to put their questions in the chat. I also have some questions, and hopefully we can have a conversation both among our 3 panelists and among the audience. Hillary asked the question, Massachusetts will vote for president in 24, governor in 22. Boston just voted for new mayor in 21, and then there are the city council and school committee elections. From a voter turnout perspective, this is challenging. I'm going to broaden it. She says thoughts on syncing up these elections to ensure greater turnout. And I want to broaden that to what reforms do you think we could be doing in Massachusetts that would increase participation, dramatically increase it, since we've seen even in our own state such low turnout numbers. Who'd like to jump in? Jonathan, why don't you unmute both Quentin and Danielle, and let's start the conversation. And also, if any of you want to pull down points that you heard the other person make and elaborate on them, feel free. Danielle, you want to jump in?
Sure, I will. I wish I could say I thought that there was a kind of magic pill or magic wand we could wave to change the dynamic here. But it really, I believe, does come back to this question of whether or not people can have the experience of winning, of being effective, to Jay's point. So winning is a much punchier way of talking about being effective. And so I do think that empowering people to win at the local level is a necessary part of building up engagement for all of the other elections. And I think that's a place where there are real pathways to victory, real pathways to helping people win for their communities. And if we could do that and invest in that experience, I think we will rebuild engagement for the other levels of our system as well.
Quentin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I mean, for as many Democrats as we have in Massachusetts, and as wonderful a progressive tradition as we have, and we do, I mean, the US Constitution was based on the Massachusetts Constitution that John Adams penned in the first instance. We have a long tradition of leadership in a lot of areas. We are not leaders on voting. We are very much behind. And there are a series of reforms that we need to pass in order to even get up to what other states are doing. Some of them are on the table, some of them are not. We need same-day registration. So we systemically block from voting people who come to register because of arbitrary and bureaucratic deadlines. Mostly that affects young people and people of color. We need to expand early voting. We need to have early voting for all elections. We need to expand vote by mail. So there are a series of really pretty, and even some of the bills that are on the table, we're not sending ballots, we're sending ballot applications. That's not going to do the trick. There's much more we can do to make in-person voting more accessible for people. So there's some basic blocking and tackling that Massachusetts does not do that we need to do right away. But I do want to return to what Danielle is saying and some of what Jay was saying, which is that fundamentally, people are going to be engaged in elections when they feel that their voice and their vote matters, when they feel that the candidates, that the campaigns are about more than the candidate, but are rather a reflection of the values that we have in our communities. And so some of the best campaigns have worked that way. I would posit that Deval Patrick's 2005-2006 campaign worked in that way, that Barack Obama's did at its best, Maura Healey's first campaign and Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I would say Michelle Wu's campaign got to a point where people involved in those campaigns were thinking about their future. They were thinking about investments in their community. They imagined possibilities. And so I think that we need to campaign in a way that respects and empowers the grassroots. And if we do that, if people believe that these campaigns are about more than these candidates, they will get invested, they will turn out, and you will see results like you saw with Ayanna Pressley running against a seasoned incumbent, where a lot of voters who are not likely voters, who are not on all of the models that all the consultants tell us to go find, saw their futures as part of what the campaign was about and came out and voted. So I think that some of this falls on us to reform the laws and take away undue obstacles to registering, voting, and having our votes count. But some of this falls on our candidates and those of us who are involved in campaigns to really connect with the grassroots and make people understand these campaigns as being about them and not about some candidates' ambitions or futures.
Jay, you want to jump in? I should
Sure.
just point out I'm getting a ton of questions that
Yeah, let
are.
me be brief then. Campaign finance reform, public financing for campaigns. Right now, you need to either spend a lot of time raising money for a campaign or have it be independently wealthy. That's not democracy. So public funding of campaigns is, I would put on the table. Secondly, there are a number of really fine training programs. Emerge comes to mind, the Initiative for Diversity and Civic Leadership that was very effective for half a dozen years, but is dormant now. Programs to encourage candidacies, especially for candidates who are not the typical mold, don't fit the typical mold. Those are really important and empower people who might otherwise not be ready to run for office to be ready and to be effective. Then we need to come up with something comparable for people who are already elected and then start to feel the pressures to suck up and conform, and how to remind them of how to stay reminded in why they ran for office in the first place. So supporting candidates, as Quentin mentioned, getting new people to run, giving them the wherewithal to do that, and then giving them the support once they're in office to maintain their focus on the kind of reforms that we're all talking about here.
Michael, can I just pitch in one more little piece
Please.
here? So like Quentin and Jay, I agree 100% about the importance of maximizing the accessibility of the ballot. Early voting and mail-in voting and the like in the Votes Act is very important. But we have to also recognize that in the pandemic, when we brought in those provisions, the increase in turnout that brought was in percentage terms much higher in affluent suburbs than it was in New Bedford, in Fall River and the like. So that's why I'm really trying to focus on the question of the experience of winning at the local level for communities that have been disengaged. I think it's a deep, deep problem in our Commonwealth, and I just really want to name it out loud.
If I could just build on what Danielle said, because we actually did a fair amount of research on this. One of the things that we've seen, so the Voter Protection Corps, we studied this a little bit. And one of the things that you see is that some of these measures to expand access to voting do tend to be disproportionately used in affluent communities. That was certainly the experience when we expanded early voting, and it's absolutely the experience with vote by mail. And vote by mail is an extremely effective technique, but in-person voting is the choice of the majority of the communities of color, and so and younger people, and so you do need to make sure that reforms focus on those solutions. I also want to add something to Jay's comment, which is that there are lots of obstacles to first-time candidates, and some of them are on the campaign finance side, which is absolutely broken. We need to, reverse Citizens United. We need to have public financing of campaigns. But I will say that there are some even harder to crack problems with personal finance. So, Jessie Mermel wrote a little bit about this after her congressional campaign. I know there's a piece of legislation about trying to make childcare something that you can pay for with campaign funds. But fundamentally, I mean, when I ran for lieutenant governor, we went 18 months without a salary. And what kinds of candidates, even qualified candidates, can afford to make it add up on the personal finance side? And I don't know quite how you solve that problem, but right now running for office is often a luxury that only the rich can afford for a lot of reasons. And that is not great for our democracy, right? These long campaigns and these expensive campaigns, one side of it is, can you scare up the money that you need to get your message out? Jay and I got outspent 18 to 1, so I mean, at a certain point, the campaign finance piece is very real, but the personal finance is real too. And if you're trying to encourage a set of new voices to come in as candidates, you've got to figure out how you can make it possible for those folks to run as a practical matter.
Thank you. So I've got 3 big questions that have been posed in the chat. I'm going to just all and then pick them in order. So one is from Abigail, who writes that she understands the importance of local and state elections, but also she raises what's happening with voting rights in Congress and the move by Republicans in various states to restrict voting rights. And if they are successful, won't that have a huge impact on our democracy and, of course, on our next election cycle, both the midterms and for the president? So that's sort of one, the national on voting rights. A second is a set of different questions that people have raised about race and racism. And some of that is in terms of the actual campaigns and what happens. And then some of that is concerns about, Jay, if we aggregate what happens to marginal voices, and a specific one for Danielle to sort of speak to that. And how do we make sure that marginalized voices are really heard effectively? And then there's questions about media and disinformation. So let's take them in order of voting rights, and then we'll go on to race, and then go into media and misinformation. All very small questions that I'm sure you can solve for us in a very few minutes. Who wants to jump in on the voting rights nationally and in the states, and the Republican moves to curtail access to the ballot?
Michael, if you'll forgive me for going first again, I might go ahead and jump in because I have to transition to another obligation. I apologize. I know you're staying on a bit longer. So I think we're at a point in time where we have to recognize that achieving a democracy, a true democracy, multicultural democracy on this land that we appropriated from others, requires more of our energies than at any time in our recent memories. And that's a big ask, okay? But I think Quentin and Jay and I are all here to say to you, we recognize your work, we value your work, you've done so much over so many years, yet we need to ask for more. And the reason is because we have to act defensively on the federal level. We have to hold the line. We have to protect voting rights, try to stop that domino effect. But then we also have to act proactively, offensively. We have to build something new, and that has to go through the state level. The federal level is too paralyzed for building the new. Building the new is going to happen at the state level. We need to build a model. Massachusetts has the potential to do that. It has the potential to do work on truth and reconciliation, as Jay suggested. It has the potential to build a healthy informational ecosystem that cuts through the disinformation that is affecting even our local politics. And it's because we have that potential here in Massachusetts that I believe we have an obligation to show the country how we can get it done. And so we have to build a model too, and then cascade that through the states on the other side, even as we're holding the line with work on the federal level. So we have to do more. I mean, to Quentin's point, I've jumped in really hard, personally sacrificing terms in exactly the way that he just described. 18 months without a salary. I'm going to name it because Quentin named it too. Thank you for naming that, Quentin. It is not easy to do. All right, but that is the time that we're in, and we have to work on both fronts simultaneously. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to be a part of this conversation. I'm sorry to have to leave now. I would love to stay for the rest of it, but I'm in Orange, Massachusetts, and I have other folks to visit with now as well. So thank you, Michael, very much.
All right, thank you, Danielle.
Thanks,
We'll
Danielle.
continue on.
Thanks,
All right,
Danielle.
Quentin and Jay, the national voting rights scene, what can be done? What's your sense of it, Quentin?
So I like to stay very positive and to focus on actionable steps. But I will say we are in a very, very dark time. And particularly when you talk about the national level. So, you know, in Congress, I think that we have a very narrow pathway to make a little bit of progress. And in some of the states, I think that we are going to see very significant retreat over the next series of elections. And I think that we do need to understand that this is going to be a long-term fight. Some of that is overt voter suppression. Some of that is gerrymandering. Some of that is campaign finance. Some of that is misinformation and disinformation. But our democracy is fundamentally in trouble. I accept the notion that some of the racism, some of the obstacles to voting have been historical from our very founding. But I will say that this is a scary time for our democracy. Now, on the sort of more sort of concrete side, I think there is a narrow window of opportunity to pass two pieces of legislation. One relates to the Voting Rights Act. This is the John Lewis bill, which I think people are familiar with the very bad U.S. Supreme Court case, Shelby, that undermined the Justice Department's ability to review racist and otherwise voter suppressive legislation that was passed in states that have been particularly bad in their voting rights. We need to restore that, but in order to do that, we have the familiar problem of the filibuster. And we have so far not been able to muster the votes either to pass the bill or to break the filibuster for the bill. The other piece of legislation has morphed a couple of times, but essentially sets the floor for some state requirements in terms of the way that we run our elections. So both of those pieces of legislation are deeply important, in doubt, and probably require a narrow change to the filibuster. We should abolish the filibuster outright, but there is a window of opportunity potentially if you could get Manchin and Sinema and maybe Feinstein and a couple of others on board to at least carve out some democracy reforms from the filibuster so that we could pass it with 51 votes. It strikes me that that's a pretty big lift and that we shouldn't be holding our breath. Some of the state level stuff is deeply, deeply scary. There's some really bad things happening in legislatures across the country. There's some really bad AGs. There's some really bad secretaries of state. And candidly, I think that we're going to see a number of our voting rights step back in a lot of places over the next few years in ways that are going to have a lot of consequences for a lot of voters that are going to be pretty hard to deal with. At a very tactical level, honestly, the way that we are going to deal with that is to win elections. We need more Democrats and more people who are committed to democracy to be voting at the national level, at the state level. We need better secretaries of state. We need better attorneys general. We need to win elections, and we need good people to appoint good judges who will help reset those laws. That is going to take a really long time. But fundamentally, the path to reforming our democracy is probably winning elections and building the coalitions legislatively that will allow us to make reforms that will save our democracy.
Jay, do you want to?
Quentin, I'm struck by the fact that you began this by saying you're optimistic and then gave me lots and lots of reasons to not be optimistic. I'm not sure I'm optimistic. As a matter of fact, I despair of the future of our democracy. I think we are being tested. We may well have been tested in the past. We were tested in the past. And in the years after 1775, it was not clear that we were going to establish a new form of government here. We were very much in jeopardy at that point. And I think we are again now. I don't know that we will come out of this with anything that looks like the kind of democracy that we all would have us do. And frankly, I get sort of hesitant to admit this, but I will admit I get overwhelmed by the prospect of what's going on nationally, having any impact on what's going on nationally. I write postcards, I make contributions to campaigns, but I'm not living in one of these states that's going off the cliff. I am living in a state that needs a lot of work here at home. And so my energy is focused on what can we do to enhance democracy, enhance voters, enhance candidates, enhance the results that come out of the legislation, out of the governor's office. What can we do here at home? How can we get people more engaged, more caring, more successful, more progressives in particular? What can we do here at home? That's, I guess it's about all I can manage right now with any sense of efficacy.
One thing I will say is that campaigns matter. Julia Mejia, I think, won by 1 vote in an at-large city council race a couple of years ago. I was very involved in the 2016 effort in New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan won by less than 1,000 votes. We kept the polls open in one of the student areas for an additional hour. You know, victory has a lot of a lot of parents, but 1,000 votes is something that GOTV and voter protection and other kinds of efforts can swing. And so I do think that being engaged at the grassroots, being engaged in campaigns, being smart about data, and one of the things the Voter Protection Corps has done is sort of marry the expertise of lawyers who've worked on voting rights over a long period of time with data science, and tried to look at the places that are most likely to have the greatest challenges and try and develop strategies that'll kind of help overcome those over time. So I do think that our efforts can be the but-for cause of meaningful changes in outcomes that can help us move in the right direction. But I would say the reason for my optimism, Jay, honestly, is young people. And if you think about the views of young people across the country, even in some pretty red places, some of the demographic changes that are happening, some of the changes in attitudes, there will come a time where we're going to win Texas every year. There will come a time when people who believe in LGBTQ rights, who think that the climate crisis is an extraordinary threat to our future, will become the plurality and then the majority of our voters. And if we can build a bridge and sustain some of our institutions long enough for some of those changes, the forces that are distorting, in particular the Republican Party. I mean, and Danielle was talking about naming things. I mean, I think one thing we have to name is that the Republican Party has been hijacked. We are in a world where we do not have 2 fully functioning parties that are working in good faith. We have one party that has been taken over, at least at the national level, and in a lot of states at the state and local level, by people who are directly undermining the fundamental principles of our democracy. And I think if we delude ourselves into pretending that that is not the case, we pursue courses of action that are going to take us backwards rather than forwards. And that breaks my heart. I would love to say that the solution to these problems is to overcome partisanship. But at the moment, I do not think that kind of partisanship, bipartisanship, is possible with Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and that set of people. And so fundamentally, I think it is about winning elections to get to the point where our coalition of power includes people who have the power to make changes that protect our democracy. And that is part of what's scary, I think.
I think we can come back to that. There's so many good things that are in the chat, but I don't want to lose the prior question. So I'd love it if the 2 of you would talk a little bit about misinformation and the media, and also the problem that the media has. Quentin, just to build on what you just said, it seems to me that the media, the mainstream media, is having a very hard time grappling with the reality of a Republican Party that is profoundly anti-democratic. They want to sort of talk about equivalency. You know, the Democrats do this, the Republicans do that. They're extremists on both sides. There's a failure to compromise on both sides, when in reality, we have one party that is profoundly anti-democratic. So if you want to jump in on sort of what's happening with the crisis of our media, the proliferation of disinformation, and how that undermines democracy, and if you think there are things that we can do, please jump in.
This is very depressing.
You get to hope in a minute.
Well, Danielle mentioned something at the very beginning of her remarks about the absence of local media and the disappearance of local newspapers, which certainly is not a cause, but it's a symptom of what's happened in the world of media, and largely it's a corporate takeover. I mean, we're looking at big business and calling it media, and there are very few traditional journalists still in the business, and very few institutions that hold to the canons of journalism. So I think of the New York Times, I think of the Washington Post. There are some, but for the most part, I mean, even the Boston Globe, that used to be a newspaper of record in this area, and it used to be reliable. Now there's some articles there out of the Times, some very good reporting by some local reporters, and some great work by the Globe Spotlight team, but a plethora of articles about murders and mayhem hither and yon, and very little in the way of a platform for informed and engaged political debate. It's not there. And I frankly don't know. I think I'm too old to understand the role of social media and what is emerging in the way of other forms of conversations that we might have with one another. I would love it if there were some younger people involved in this conversation who probably have a greater sense of instinct about that than I do. I tend to think that moments like this don't need to lead down a rabbit hole or lead to periods of enormous darkness. They can also produce incredible creativity and breakthroughs. So I'm holding my breath here for some kind of breakthrough. I know that as a candidate, well, I was watching people running for the city council in Boston right now. They had an incredibly difficult time getting a platform to speak to voters or to hear from voters because all the air was taken up by the mayoral race. So for those people who are running for state house or for local city councils or boards of select boards, it's very hard to get airtime in the world of media as we have known it. So people more creative than I am need to come up with some new ways for us to communicate.
So I agree with Jay and with Danielle that one of the keys here is to invest in trying to save local journalism. The business models have changed fundamentally. And I think that there is a public interest in investment in local journalism to ensure that we're getting good information about local races and that we can build that back up. There are some very good foundation-led efforts in that space. So I think that's important. Common Cause has done some really good work on combating misinformation and disinformation online. Voter Protection Corps and worked a little bit with some of those folks in the last cycle. And I think the theory there is that the best response to disinformation is actually sort of proactive, good information, that if you can flood the zone with pro-voter information, that is often somewhat antiseptic to the kinds of disinformation efforts that are focused on voter suppression. So you do absolutely want to have a listening communities that allow for rapid response to disinformation efforts. But really the best investment is probably in proactively informing voters of good information. There are, so my friend and colleague Karen Kornblue and her colleague Ellen Goodman have done some really interesting work on circuit breakers. So people are familiar with the notion of circuit breakers in the context of markets, when the markets start to spiral out of control, trying to stop it and cool people down. There's been some interesting thinking about viral misinformation and trying to create a circuit breaker when various kinds of misinformation starts to spread. So at the platform level, causing that to stop. There, I think fundamentally is a lot of work that we need to do at the level of what are called platforms. So Facebook, Google, Apple, Twitter, TikTok, to put them in a position where they are better equipped to police their own ecosystems. And obviously there are some tricky First Amendment issues in terms of how you put them in a position where they're policing bad speech. But fundamentally, we need for there to be some oversight to these discussions so that bad information, whether it's about the pandemic or about voting or about anything else, has a mechanism for being moderated quickly and in real time. But this is going to be a real challenge. It's one of the things that is being weaponized in the campaign space. So some of it is sort of structural and has to do with the business models, but there are bad actors, many of them associated with foreign governments that mean us harm, that are weaponizing misinformation as a tool for distorting our democracy. And I do think we have to face this also as a national security challenge. So lots to do in this space.
Indeed. Let's jump to two other things. The first, there are a range of people who've made questions and comments about the need for positive message, and not just a positive message, but also to prove, as Danielle was saying, that governing works and delivers for people. And given the challenges of inequality, of climate change, of transportation, of housing, and profound growing inequality. What are your thoughts, both nationally and the state, that we can do to govern effectively and deliver results that change people's attitudes, because we actually have produced serious reforms that matter in people's lives? Who'd like to jump in?
I want to jump in by building on something Chuck Dickinson just entered into the chat. He asked us what we think about some kind of required national service. I'm absolutely a big fan of required service. And as a matter of fact, I would, if I were the governor and had a pen, could do this, I would require of all high school graduates that they will have put in a year of public service before they graduate. I talked before about the need for civics education. Civics education isn't about somebody standing in front of the room and telling his or her students, this is what you should do. It's about getting engaged. It's learning by doing. And if we start involving tomorrow's citizens, tomorrow's voters, and tomorrow's leaders in some of these issues that you're talking about, Michael, some of these really critical issues that are facing us, get them working on them, get them engaged in them in their formative years, and take advantage of the brain power and the energy that they bring to it. It would be a very different universe if we had a bunch of young people worrying about cleaning up the streets and cleaning up some of the neighborhoods that are in need of attention, or going door to door and raising awareness of the need for campaign finance reform, going door to door, raising awareness of the threat that climate change represents to us. We could easily, I think, after some fighting, but ultimately easily, identify some areas that need some transformative work to make our society work, and put our youth to those tasks. Not only have the contribution to address those immediate needs, but also engage them in a way that's going to make them much more responsible adults.
Quentin, you want to jump in either on national service or on the larger political problem?
Well, by the way, Let me just add that we can do this
Yeah.
as a state. I don't think it's going to happen nationally anytime soon, although I'd love to be wrong about that. But we could do it as a state as a matter of legislation, if there were simply the will to do it.
Quentin?
So I really enjoyed running statewide in 2018. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was sort of going out to communities and talking to people and hearing about what was actually sort of going on in your life. So when you're a candidate, there's sort of a little bit this tendency that you should like know all the answers and you should have an answer to things. And if you ever don't have an answer to a question, it's a point of vulnerability. If you can kind of like set that aside and actually listen to what people care about in their communities, you learn a lot about what is going on in people's lives, and then you sort of get better as a candidate and ideally as an elected official. And I say that because I think a lot of the things that sort of don't work in our politics right now, filtered through Fox News or filtered through sort of large engines where we sort of slice into red and blue and where we sort of are screaming at each other, actually kind of dissolves a little bit at the local level. And if you can actually sort of connect with people and sort of understand what the challenges are that people face in their families and their communities, some of the partisanship, I mean, we've all had sort of uncomfortable Thanksgiving table conversations too. I mean, you know, local politics, you know, and family politics get tricky too, but you can actually often boil that down. And so I think the answer on the national service question and the answer on sort of how you get people engaged is actually to try to tie the policy and the challenges to the things that are happening in local communities, the things that people actually care about in their own lives. And that some of those things are big picture and are common across areas, but some of them are really very local and idiosyncratic. And it may be that in your community, the real issue is the opioid crisis has hit really hard, or that you can't get access to local Wi-Fi, or that you don't like your school committee, or that transportation is difficult, or that you know, there's racially motivated policing. You know, but a lot of that is local. And a lot of the key, I think, to getting people engaged in service is to equate the activity with the things that matter in people's lives, and sort of take it down from the talking points and take it down from some of the very big national debates and talking points.
So I want to turn us for our last 15 minutes or so to look to the future and to engage in two questions. What is it that people can do over the next 2 years? And the second is how to keep hope alive and working. I've noticed in my conversations with people a dramatic change from May and June of this year. In May and June of this year, people thought the Biden administration was going to be a transformational administration, that the pandemic was licked and we could return to normalcy, and that the extremism of the Republican Party was headed for marginalization. And now people feel like the Biden administration may or may not produce results, that the pandemic seems with us, and that the Republican Party is effective at using the structural advantages it has. And there is, I think, progressives, a real sense of despair. I'm going to say a few things about that after you all do. I want to turn it over to you to talk and address, to not minimize the threats and the dire situation, but how do we keep hope alive and motivating us and getting us out to do the work that we need to do? Who wants to jump in and take that simple question?
Let me be foolish. Let me be foolish and jump in. Michael, you and I sort of share, among other things, a passion for writing. And lately I've been very drawn to, oh God, I'm blanking on her name right now. Oh, Julia Cameron's book. Her original book was The Artist's Way, and the more recent book is The Right to Write. And one of the takeaways from her work is that if you're writing, and this holds true for if you're engaged in life, start where you are. We can't pretend away the pandemic. We can't pretend away or wish away the fact that we're despairing of some of the circumstances around us, political and otherwise. So being in denial about that takes a tremendous amount of energy and is unproductive. It just doesn't work. So I think acknowledging, as you just did, I think very, very wisely and very correctly, some of the things that have changed since the spring when we did have hope. We're going to have to live with this uncertainty about where we're headed for as long as we have to live with it. There's nothing to be done. We can't wish it away. That said, we've also got to begin where we are. So what can we each do? And I'm not sure there's a universal answer to that. In my case, it's writing. I'm trying to get some thoughts out and maybe take a look at some historical precedents, and more importantly, look at some things that give me hope. It's taking care of myself and my family. I'm playing a lot more piano now than I ever have before. Personal therapy, if you will. And then trying to strike where it's possible to make a difference. I would love dearly to be contacted after this with people who are thinking about running for the State House. We need new and better candidates running for the State House. So if anybody's listening to this and has been tempted to do it, but isn't doing it because the culture in there is so debilitating and demeaning that who the hell wants to get elected to that institution anyway? You do. We need new candidates to run, stay focused on the kind of reforms that we're all talking about here and that we're all very passionate about. So I guess again, speaking just for myself and very personally, I struggle with the upset, with the fear, with the cynicism. And then I have a cup of coffee and pick up a pen or pick up the phone and do what I can. So I think we each need to, I mean, in Quentin's case, it's running for office right now. I've been there, done that. I'm not doing that again. But sure as hell, I'm happy to encourage others and empower others to do that. And more, and equally importantly, be there holding their hands and with my arm around them and encouraging them and giving them a bit of a kick in the butt when they need it to do a really good job once they get elected.
So I deeply believe in what Jay just said in terms of local candidates, local politics, getting good people involved in elections. But I'm going to highlight a different piece of this in answer to your question, which goes back a little bit to sort of when Barack Obama was first elected president. I think he fundamentally believed that he was going to change the culture of Washington, that he was going to find people on the other side of the aisle who were trying to make the world a better place, and that we were going to build a bipartisan future together. And I think within the course of about 18 or 24 months, figured out that was not possible given the state of the National Republican Party. And I think one of the things that some of us on the left have learned is that you don't actually get anything out of pre-compromising. We pre-compromised on healthcare reform. We should have gone big on single payer in the first instance, as opposed to building it around the Heritage Foundation's ideas. Bill Clinton, towards the end of his presidency, was tinkering around the edges. And recently, I think we've understood that we need to move the Overton window on some things that really matter. Bernie Sanders has been wonderful at this in terms of saying, no, we should actually go for making college free and getting rid of all of this debt. We should go big on universal health care. Recently, we've seen Elizabeth Warren go big on a number of these issues. I think you see fundamentally Michelle Wu won this mayoral race by saying, no, I've got some big ideas. I'm going to make the tea fare free. We're going to go back to rent control. I think that we have not done ourselves any favors by being timid. And in fact, what we should do is acknowledge that we have very big challenges: poverty and inequality, racial injustice, the climate crisis, access to healthcare and housing and other kinds of fundamental services. And I think that the answer to keeping people motivated in this kind of an environment, besides the hyperlocal piece of what Jay was saying, which I fundamentally agree with, is to be bold and say, essentially, these are the things that we would do if we had the power to do them. Imagine a world in which we took bold steps to deal with poverty and inequality, to deal with racial injustice, to combat the climate crisis, and put it to voters that we are going to be transformational. And I think that that boldness will pay off over time, not just in terms of shifting the Overton window and getting us to better policies, but also in getting voters to care about elections, because we're not nibbling at the edges. We're promising and then delivering on bold promises.
I couldn't agree more with both of you. I just want to add another dimension to it. I recently saw a Pew poll on real progress. Did anyone else happen to see the Pew poll? It was probably about a month ago. They asked a question of how can progress racial relations and racial justice. And it was fascinating to me. 70% of Republicans said the country had, and an almost equal number of Democrats said the country had not. The reason I find this so disturbing is because I'm turning 75 in January, and my first political involvement of the 1960s. And when I was young and active, in 26 states, men and women, different races, not allowed to marry. In Virginia, where I was an 8-year-old, there were segregated water fountains, and a repressive voting system. The idea that we have not made progress on race relations is one of the things that allows us to despair, because it prevents us from the impact of movements and organizing. We have made huge progress. That does not in any way deny the vicious white backlash that we are experiencing now, but does give us a path forward. And the path forward is what we've all known, everybody on this call, which is that we have to organize, not mourn. And while I think despair is reasonable, given the, I think it also fails to understand what Quentin was saying. Young people, even local people, are way to the left of older people. And the challenge for us is to build that bridge to a future when young people can take the country in a much better place. And that is a challenge that I think is manageable. The right is not growing. It is not that there are more conservatives today than there were 10 years ago. It's just not true. Structurally, they have big changes. And so I want to return to the question of what can we do over the next couple of years? And one, I think, and I'll ask Jay and Quentin to talk to it one time, is to truly make Massachusetts more of a beacon for what a progressive state would look like. The second is to do everything that we can to win in the midterms, even as challenging and difficult as that will be. And I can address the second, but I'd like Quentin to one more time take on how do we make Massachusetts a beacon of what a progressive state really could do in a way that dramatically changes people's expectations of politics, of democracy, and of governance. I'll go Jay, then.
You broke up a little bit there, but I think you called on me. So,
I did.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'm excited to hear you say that we should devote our energy to making Massachusetts the beacon that we'd like to think that it is, and that it certainly has been historically. So I'm all in on that one. I find it very exciting that all of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for governor are progressive. And we can despair over the fact that they may divide the spoils amongst them. But it's very exciting to me that we have candidates who are willing to do exactly what you just said, Michael. They're willing to be bold, be direct, and say this, this is who we could be, and we're going to move in that direction. I took a lot of comfort, as I think Quentin, you suggested as well, from Michelle Wu's election. She has been bold, and she's got the background and the support to move forward with a very aggressive agenda. So I think there's every reason to think that we can also get candidates to run for the state legislature on a similarly progressive platform. And I agree with Quentin completely. We have not been bold enough. We collectively have not been bold enough. We've thought that somehow or other we've got to play to some kind of middle ground. I think that's why we've lost our constituency, because we've been playing. We haven't been acting true to our values. So I think all the groups that are out there encouraging candidacies and supporting candidacies need to redouble their effort, and they need to be joined by yet other groups to make sure that we've got a very full slate of candidates running in 2022. This is a great time to be thinking about running. This is the right time to be thinking about running. I think one measure of our success will be if we have a whole bunch of competing candidates running in the primary I guess it'll be in April of 2022 or May, whenever the primary is. Getting into this race right now or at the beginning of the next calendar year is exactly right to be positioned so that by the time we have a primary in the spring, all these issues of investing in public education, fair taxation, addressing climate change, addressing the healthcare needs, addressing the gross disparities of wealth and opportunity, addressing the concentration of power within the legislature. Run on those issues and then win, and then we can within the 2022 calendar cycle, we can actually make a big difference. And to offer a little bit of hope here, not every candidate who jumps in with this kind of platform, with this kind of vision will win. But all it takes is 3, 4, 5 strategic wins, and in particular, 3 or 4 or 5 strategic defeats. If we can beat some of the really bad guys and the people who are saying, no, we can't, or we've got to maintain business as usual, it would send shockwaves through the institution if we were to undermine that perceived truth and actually reshape the conversation just with 5 or 6 big victories and 5 or 6 big defeats. And then 2 years from now, we'll build then we'll build a bigger majority because we'll have a track record. So it's a sustained effort true to our values and speaking from those values.
Thank you, Jay. Quentin, last words from you. We have to unmute you. Jonathan, can you unmute Quentin?
So I
Good.
want to take a moment to give a shout out to Progressive Watertown and Progressive Mass, because you asked the question of how do we make Massachusetts a beacon, and I think that there's a wonderful kind of legislative agenda that has been built up through Progressive Mass, and advancing that legislative agenda is going to take us a really long way towards making us a beacon in those ways. So the Fair Share Amendment is one of the things that we should be fighting for. We ought to raise the revenue that we need by making our tax system more fair, and then invest it in transportation and in education. Those are going to, we're in a world where there's a lot of money coming into Massachusetts from the federal government, and there are going to be the resources to invest in our priorities. We ought to continue to expand access to healthcare and make sure that we're starting to grapple with the racial disparities in healthcare. We ought to do more to make it possible for people to afford to live here. We ought to deal with some of the racial disparities in housing. Some of these voting reforms are very important. I think the Votes Act would be a very big step forward. I don't think it's enough, but I think that it would get us a lot of needed democracy reforms. I'd like to see greater attention to outright poverty. I think the way that we're handling mass and caste is a disgrace. We need to actually treat homelessness and mental health and substance use disorder as fundamental problems that deserve those kinds of direct services. I think that we ought to be a little bit more directly focused on racial segregation. So one of the fundamental problems with public education right now is disparities in funding. So I live in Weston, where we spend an enormous amount more per pupil than they spend in Brockton or in Worcester. But fundamentally, our schools are as racially divided as when Brown versus Education came down. And until we deal with that set of sort of structural racist living patterns, a lot of the things that flow from that are not going to get dealt with. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think that if we back good candidates and invest in these elections, we can make a lot of progress on that.
Thank you, Quentin. So let me just conclude by saying the second part of what I think is the path forward is to do work for the term. It's going to be hard. I think we need to have a push to make Massachusetts the beacon it should be, and we have to have a push to hold the House and the Senate. There are going to be 4 House races that are the critical battlegrounds for deciding the control of the House, and there are going to be 9 states that will be the critical 9 states. Everybody take a look at togetherweelect.org. I just put it in the chat, and you can find activities. There'll be New Hampshire will be one of the states that's a battleground again, and it's easy for us to get there. And it's also easy for us to do remote work, mobilizing both volunteers and voter protection, and also doing direct voter contact in the critical races. So we're over our time. I want to first thank everybody for playing. I want to especially thank Quentin and Jay and Danielle for being with us tonight. I also want to express appreciation for the Progressive Watertown members who put this event together: Carolyn Bays, Eileen Ryan, Rita Colafella, and Diane Tiernan. Many thanks also to Jonathan Cohn of Progressive Mass for using the Zoom account and for us, and to Leslie Evans, who designed the digital flyer. And I just want to end again by saying we all have an enormous amount of work cut out for us. I know that Progressive Mass will continue its great work in Massachusetts, and I hope all of us will together with Progressive Mass to make Massachusetts the beacon of progress that it should be, and also that we will work together to have an impact on the elections. So thank you so much, panelists, and thank you so much for all of you who've participated in today's panel. Thank you and goodbye.